My profession is I'm a culinary historian. I study the history of food to see not only what it tells us about the past, but to understand why we are who we are today, why we eat what we eat today. And I especially like food history because it allows us to access the stories of people who don't normally get talked about in the history books. We get to read a lot about white men in history, but when you talk about food, you get to talk about women and people of color. And the book that I wrote, 8 Flavors, is really a look at American history, but looking at the fact that America is a diverse country and has always been a diverse country. So that's what I do, and that's why I'm passionate about it. And also, just so you know, this lecture I did before the Brooklyn Historical Society, which is where your professor came and saw me, and it was a whole night devoted to bourbon and drinking. So if you ever think that like your professor isn't cool and like doesn't do fun things by herself, like she was clearly out there getting wasted on a Wednesday. So there you go. So what we're going to talk about today is we're going to talk about taxation, which I know doesn't sound like the most exciting topic, but taxes didn't always exist in this country. And the earliest taxes that we had, which, let me put it this way, taxes fund our government. So we used to only get money for our government based on tariffs. A tariff is when a ship is importing goods historically, and they come into port, and they have to pay a certain percentage of what the goods on their ship were valued at. And so for a long time, that is exclusively what funded our government. But right after the Revolutionary War, we were pretty broke. We were a young country that had just fought this massive war for independence, and we didn't have a lot of money. So we had to figure out how to get out of debt so we could get on our feet as a new country. Broke. So we've got our original 13 colonies, which are now the original 13 states, and they're meeting to try to figure out what to do. And there's one guy that is in charge of all this, who is this guy. This is a test of how nerdy you are. Does anyone know, I know it's a little hard to see, does anyone know who this guy is? You can just shout it out. Yeah, it's Hamilton. Can we turn off one row of lights? Is that possible? Yeah, so he's become really pretty famous nowadays. Alexander Hamilton, now starring on Broadway. And his role in early America was that he was the head of our treasury. But he was also like Washington's second-hand man during the Revolutionary War. Like he was managing a lot of military campaigns as well. So it's he who has to figure out how we're going to get money back in our national bank account, how we're going to get out of debt. So he travels to London and Paris, and he looks at how London and Paris handle taxation. And what both of those cities and both of those country governments do is they tax the sale of alcohol. So alcohol is considered essentially a luxury. So both of these cities, these governments, they have a luxury tax, which it runs in essentially different ways, but particularly in London, they tax the size of a still. So the still is the thing that you make alcohol in. You boil something like a grain mash, essentially beer, or you boil wine and make brandy, you boil beer and make whiskey. You're boiling out the alcohol, which has a lower boiling point, from the water, which has a higher boiling point. Yes. So once you distill something, it has a higher alcohol content. So when you're producing alcohol, whether you're a small company or a large one, you're using a still. So in London, they were taxing the size of the still and also how many gallons of alcohol you produced at your distillery. So he decides to bring this idea back to the United States. This will be the first time. Do you have a question already? Go for it. How much was it? You know what, I actually don't know, and it really varied. I don't know for London, but when they bring the idea back to here, they tax slightly different in cities versus the countryside. In the cities, they tax how many gallons you produce, and it was like an 8 to 10 cent tax per gallon. They didn't tax them based on population, so this is only taxing the production of alcohol. So there's tariff taxes, which is taxing if you're importing goods, and now there's going to be this alcohol tax in America. We do not tax income at that point. That this happens in the 1860s. So we'll actually touch on that too, because that starts happening during the Civil War. So we're going to hit that next. So this is only if you make alcohol, we are now going to tax you between 8 and 10 cents a gallon if you live in New York City. And New York was an area where a lot of alcohol was distilled too. So for producers in the cities, that wasn't a big deal because then they just passed that, that expense on to the consumers. Now, as a consumer, if you're out there buying a gallon of alcohol, you're going to pay 8 to 10 cents more, which is a fair amount of money because the average salary was about $1 a day. This is more problematic for rural distillers. So originally, we don't have any taxation. Oh, and there's something I wanted to say, too. So we've got rural distillers. The frontier at this point is in western Pennsylvania. Like, Pittsburgh is considered so far out that no one in their sane mind would live out there. So when you're over the Appalachian Mountains, when you're on this frontier in America, the system of distilling and buying alcohol is different. So in the city, you can imagine it actually almost as it is today. You go to a liquor store, you buy alcohol, that's what happens. There are large distilleries that get taxed on the production of alcohol, boom. In the country, it's a little bit different. So in the countryside, you are growing crops. You're growing grain, you're like corn and barley and wheat. And it is expensive for you as a farmer to get those crops to a city to sell them. You have to take them over the Appalachian Mountains. So oftentimes by the time they got to a point of sale like Philadelphia or New York or Baltimore, those crops might be bad, they might be infested with rodents, with insects. So the farmers on the western frontier would do something to make their crops both more valuable and more transportable. They would take those grains like corn and whiskey and barley and they would distill them into alcohol. Now you've got a gallon of whiskey as opposed to a barrel of corn, and this is portable, it doesn't go bad, and it's more valuable than your original corn. Whiskey costs more money, you'll make more money selling it than corn. So people on the western frontier were taking their crops and turning it into alcohol, and then that's not even necessarily what they would sell, that was often the currency on the western frontier. These farmers were traditionally cash poor, meaning that, well, let's talk about this. They weren't happy about this tax at all. They didn't want to pay it. They were not interested at all. And this has to do with the idea of what money is. So what even is money? Money is a promise. Money is a trust fall between a vendor, a purchaser, and the government. So when our federal bank was first instituted, actually I have to take it back even further. In the beginning, there was no national treasury. Banks were independent businesses. And this is one of the earliest paper currencies in America that was released actually by our government during the Revolutionary War. It's for $1/3 of a dollar, which is a very strange amount. This is a promise that if you give this to somebody, they can go to the National Bank of America, turn in this piece of paper, and will get back gold worth $1/3 of a dollar. After the Revolutionary War, banks were split up and they were independent banks. So you would go to the Bank of Brooklyn, and the Bank of Brooklyn had its own dollar bills, and you could, not every vendor would accept them. So if you took your dollar bill to the corner bodega and tried to buy like some gum and an Arizona iced tea, the owner of that store would decide whether or not to accept that dollar bill. Because if they accepted that dollar bill, it was a promise. And for it to have real value, they would have to go back to the Bank of Brooklyn and trade it in for gold. The whole idea is that paper money represents actual gold, either held in our treasury or held by a private bank, all right? So there's a little bit of trust between you and the person giving you this money that these dollar bills aren't faked, which absolutely happened, and also that the bank that this came from actually has money to back it up. The crazy part about it now is that we do not have enough gold in our treasury to back all of the currency out in the world. And that's, for the most part, how money works in the modern world. It is now not even a literal representation of gold that exists somewhere. It's now, it's all imaginary. Like, we use money because we trust our government that our government won't fail. But if our government does fail, our money is worth nothing because it is literal, actual pieces of paper that nobody cares about unless that sort of trust and that whole idea of economics exists, okay? So the reason money has to do with all of this is that those distillers on the frontier, they didn't have a lot of cash. There weren't any banks. They were doing a barter system, and one of the big things they were using to purchase the goods that they needed every day was the alcohol that they were distilling. And this gets even more complicated with the tax that Hamilton wants to put into place, which was fine for the city dwellers, but out in the countryside, the tax was required to be paid in cash. But these farmers didn't have any money because they had no need for it, and because sort of the structure of the government didn't really exist on the western frontier. So when this trickles out west, that's why people are like, nah, I'm not paying this. This doesn't make sense for us. We don't even have the money to pay it. And then if they didn't have the cash to pay it, they would get ticketed. So they would get fined. So then they owed even more money than they didn't have. So you can see why this starts to turn into a volatile situation, especially because we're a new republic. We just rebelled against tyranny. We just declared our freedom from a foreign king. And now some people think that the president, Washington, and the Secretary of the Treasury, Hamilton, are acting like tyrants, that they are doing the same thing that King George was doing to us that made us want to break away from the country. So this becomes problematic, and it leads to the 1791 Whiskey Rebellion. The short story is people got so pissed off that they were going to be taxed money that they didn't have for something that they considered a daily commodity, that they rebelled against the government. Things come to a head when, yeah, that's what I want. So over the 3 years between 1791 and 1794, there are what I would call little skirmishes, and they're largely directed at the people who are required by the government to tax the locals. So every community had a tax agent, and that tax agent would go to you and say, how big is your still? You owe the government this much money. And they ended up being these constant clashes. So this is the house of a guy named Neville, and in July of 1794, an angry mob came together in front of his house. He was the local big-time tax collector. He was also a really rich farmer. He had the cash to pay these taxes, so it wasn't a big deal for him. And he was the one going around and collecting taxes. And when the mob comes upon his house, he gets nervous. He shoots a gun out his window. He kills a couple people in the crowd. And now people are really, really mad. Yeah, this is our early country, early democracy. People are getting shot for protesting, essentially, these taxes. This is a letter between Hamilton and Washington where they're discussing what's going on. And Hamilton has been accused of being a little bit heavy-handed in his response. Washington, too. Washington says, we will not let the opinions of a few decide the future of a many. It's a slight paraphrase. But basically he's saying, these podunk farmers way out west, they're not going to tell us what our republic is going to do. And Hamilton, this is paraphrased too, is basically like, yeah! And that's like that's what he responds. Like, he's really pumped, and he's like, yes, we need to put down this rebellion. We need to employ military action. So in September 1794, so a few months after, oh, and I forgot to mention, not only after Neville shot somebody, one of the local tax collectors was actually tarred and feathered, which is a real thing that happens. And if you survive, it's incredibly painful. I mean, you're being dipped in the hot tar, and feathers are put on it. And when you pull the feathers off, it actually pulls the skin off your body, too. So things were getting violent way out in the western frontier. So September in 1794, George Washington mounts his war horse, and he leads an army of 13,000 west over the Appalachia and into the western frontier of Pennsylvania. This is the largest single army that had ever been assembled in the United States. It was larger than any single army during the Revolutionary War. And this army was being turned against its own people, other Americans. And by the way, Washington getting up on his horse was largely symbolic. He's getting kind of old at this point, so he rode about a mile, got down off the horse, and then went the rest of the way by carriage. And then he kind of showed up, and he's like, all right, Hamilton, you handle this. So Hamilton was really the one who was at the front of the lines of all this. They show up at this field where about 1,000 angry protesters had gathered, and the military presence sort of breaks down this active rebellion because people don't want to die, essentially, is what it comes down to. So Hamilton was really at the heart of this. He was the one that encouraged the president to take military action against its own people, which many people in the government at that time thought was very, very heavy-handed. And this is actually the start of the two-party political system that we have today, because you had sort of like urban, people supported the urban and growing industrial class, like Washington and Hamilton and John Adams, and then you had people that aligned themselves with rural interest, which included Jefferson and Monroe, who would later become president. So when Jefferson is elected in 1802, this is after Washington decides he doesn't want to be president anymore. He's running, and as is John Adams. John Adams supports essentially city dwellers and industrial interests. Jefferson is the one who thought that using military action against farmers who were protesting was bullshit. And that's a word that he would say. He did call, like, Adams a howling hermaphrodite at one point. So, like, things got kind of nasty during this election. So he uses the Whiskey Rebellion and this thing that people thought was really violent and unfair against other Americans to position himself, and he wins the election in 1802. And very shortly after, he does away with this alcohol tax. So in the end, this rebellion and this protest was very, very successful, and kind of an interesting moment in American history because it revealed our fear of having our new government overthrown. It revealed that we could still have tyrannical tendencies, just like when we were ruled as a colony. And it set up this opposition between, I guess, what we could later call the Democratic Party, and then we would consider Jefferson a Republican for aligning with rural ideas. But anyway, he kicks John Adams' ass in that election. So that is the first time that we tax alcohol, and we use that tax to pay for government debts. So before I go then into the 19th century to the second time we do it, I threw a lot of information at you. So does anyone have questions about the Whiskey Wars? No, the Whiskey Rebellion. Yeah. Neville, Neville. There's a great book out called Dead Distillers. It's written by, I just forgot his last name. It's written by the guy who's the head distiller at Kings County Distillery, which is the first alcohol distillery, the longest continually operating whiskey distillery in Brooklyn. It was opened in 2012. It's the first one that has been opened since Prohibition. And he's a great writer, knows a lot about alcohol history. And so he really covers the Whiskey Rebellion in his book, as well as other stories about other interesting people who made alcohol and are now dead distillers. Pick it up your local library. Other questions? There are two questions here, really. Is there a different way he could have raised money for the Treasury? And is there a different way that he could have solved this crisis without taking military action? So what do you think? There's no wrong answers here. I mean, that's the thing. There's no wrong answers, except maybe Hamilton's answer was probably not a good answer. But, like, this is all a matter of opinion. We can't really say what the right answer would have been. So you can have an opinion. Does anyone else have a thought? Like, first of all, what could have Hamilton done to raise money? Yeah.
I understand where people are coming from, that, we just got rid of the tyranny.
Yeah.
And, now Alexander Hamilton and George Washington hand down this tax on whiskey, that what you call that is commodity that we use on a regular basis. And I can see sort of resistance, but it was a means to get us out of debt.
Right.
So, I can see it both two-folded. Both sides of the spectrum. And
Totally.
I think there was maybe not going to war, but maybe there was a different resolution that could have came about.
Is there some other way? So the big problem was on the West, people didn't have the money to pay the tax. Is there a different way? Go ahead. What do you think?
Well, since after the war, because we're done with the war, then there's more job opportunities for the people. So he could have made he could have started building railroads or pathways from Pennsylvania to New York to start either production or people working, and then it makes it also accessible from the people from Pennsylvania to New York.
So the government could have put in infrastructure to help people sell their crops and have more access to cash flow.
Because people are coming back for more, so you could create jobs, and you could also make employment for the farmers and the people living in New York.
Absolutely. And I think that also speaks to a little bit of we're used to this idea of you work a job, you get money, that's how the economy works. But that is really a late 19th century idea, which you'll probably get into in this class. Traditionally, if you're a subsistence farmer, you are not necessarily making money. You are growing your food, and you might have one cash product, which in this case would be whiskey or something you've distilled, that you are using to barter to get the things that you don't grow on your farm. So for up until the mid-19th century, when the Industrial Revolution happens, the majority of people in America weren't working jobs that paid cash. They were farmers, which is how they lived their entire existence. We weren't a cash-based economy outside of cities. That only changes when more factory jobs are created. So especially at the end of the 19th century, the idea of job creation, which is something that's big in politics right now, right? Create jobs, wasn't really an issue because people farmed. If you didn't work in a city, and very, very few people did at that point, and they had jobs like tanners and cobblers and things like that, you were a farmer and you didn't really have a lot of need for money. So there was also this sort of bigger problem where we were imposing a cash tax on a country that wasn't really using money for the most part outside of places like New York, Boston, Baltimore, DC, Philadelphia. Because keep in mind, the frontier is Pennsylvania, which is crazy to think about. Other thoughts or questions? Go ahead, go for it. The countryside resisted about this tax because it was sort of like they were between a rock and a hard place. So they were being charged based on the size of their still. So in some ways they were being charged slightly more than people in the cities were. Not by, like in the cities they were making a lot more alcohol. Let's say they were being charged more per gallon because the way they were being charged was slightly different. They were mostly upset because they were farmers, they didn't have cash to pay the tax. And when they didn't pay the tax, they were then fined, which means they owed the government more money. And it was taxing something that was essentially their form of cash. The best way I can describe it, which is a great transition to what we're going to talk about next, which is the whiskey wars, which take place during the 1860s here in Brooklyn. The idea was, like, imagine if someone taxed you every time you baked a sheet of cookies. That now we have a cookie tax. The government of the United States right now is like, we need to get ourselves out of debt. We don't want to be in debt to China anymore, so we're going to start taxing you every time you make cookies. Even if you're not a business, it doesn't matter. If you're making cookies in your home, you now owe us $1 for every sheet of cookies. How would you feel about that? Mad? You would not pay the cookie tax? What would you do instead?
I don't know.
That's part of the issue, right? Yeah. So if you're saying this is an unfair tax and I'm not going to pay it, what do I do? I mean, you're looking at me like I'm crazy, but that is exactly what's happening. We think of alcohol right now is a controlled substance, right? Like any other drug. Alcohol right now is something that if you're making at home, it's considered illegal. If you're distilling at home, it's considered illegal. But the only reason it's considered illegal is because it is now a taxable substance. So it made something that was previously as common in somebody's home as baking a tray of cookies now into an illegal activity. Because if you're upset about that cookie tax and you don't pay that cookie tax, you're now a criminal. That's what this tax was, and this is the big issue in the 1860s, and this is how people are viewing it. So up until this point, a lot of people think about moonshiners or distillers as being rural. But in Brooklyn in the early 19th century, there were a lot of people who were distilling. There were a lot of distilleries, a lot of them, but also there were a lot of people who were just making a gallon or two of alcohol to sell, to make ends meet, to make their rent. It was not illegal since, again, now this tax was repealed about 50 years previous. And it was something that a lot of people did every single day. So let me give you a little bit more background on this. Okay, so the Civil War happens. We are broke again. Wars cost money. Getting into them puts our country in debt, period. So in 1862, this is the first time we employ an income tax, which is what we will all be paying in a couple months by April 15th this year. So that is only put into place in the 1860s. Between when Jefferson repealed that original whiskey tax and the advent of the income tax, our only income again came from tariffs. So taxes on people importing goods into the United States. We need more money. So it doesn't affect everybody. It affects people who make over $10,000 a year, essentially. So it affects the very, very, very rich in America in the 1860s. But at the same time, we also put into place the excise tax. And the excise tax is a tax on the creation of a gallon of alcohol. So this is unlike the original tax in the 1790s. It taxes everybody at the same rate, whether you're urban or rural. So the 1862 tax, this is early on in the Civil War, is 20 cents per gallon. And again, the inflation really hasn't increased very much, so the average salary is about $1 a day. This cost is passed on to the purchaser. However, we are so hard up for cash that by the end of the war, 1865, the taxes now jumped to $2 per gallon. So the tax for 1 gallon of alcohol is now 2 days of work for the average person. So that makes alcohol really expensive to purchase and also really expensive to produce. Oh, actually, let me give you a little bit of a comparison. So $2 in 1865 with inflation today would be about $30 per gallon. I know you guys make more than about $15 a day, but inflation really isn't actually a direct comparison. And the tax on a gallon of alcohol today isn't actually $30. It's less than half that. It's $13.50. So the tax on alcohol in 1865 is more than twice what's the tax of a gallon of alcohol today. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of why people were upset about it. So here in Brooklyn, as I mentioned, there are a lot of distilleries. But unlike what happened in Western Pennsylvania in the 1790s, the Brooklyn distillers had a different approach to it. They didn't protest, they didn't organize, they didn't tar and feather anybody. They just decided they were not going to pay it. Let me give you, I pulled this out because I wanted to read you this number very, very specifically. So in 1867, 2 years after the Civil War is over, the government collected only $21,600 from Brooklyn distillers, when in fact, the volume of liquor they produced should have yielded $1.225 million in taxes. So they should have been paying $1.2 million, and as a city, Brooklyn paid $21,000. So they just weren't paying the taxes. They thought it was unfair, they thought it was ridiculous, so they said no. But going along with what I said earlier, we're now taxing something that had otherwise been legal. And when you do that, it creates a different idea of what a criminal is and what a criminal activity is. Before 1862, all these distillers in Brooklyn were just making a product like anybody else. After 1862, if you weren't paying your taxes, you were now a criminal. It happened that quickly. So what is it they were actually making here? Well, there's a product called Brooklyn rum, believe it or not. Because along the East River, there were a lot of sugar refineries, including what would become Domino's Sugar. And one of the byproducts of sugar refining is molasses. Semi-refined sugar was being shipped up from the Caribbean, and then the molasses was usually centrifuged out of it, which means they spun it really, really, really fast, and all the molasses went to the side of a barrel and dripped down. So you have granulated white sugar, and then you have molasses that is essentially a waste product. So people would really come up to like the back door of the sugar refineries, buy barrels of molasses, mix that with a fermented grain mash like wheat or corn, and make this Brooklyn rum that was somewhere, it was like a rumski. It was like somewhere between a rum and a whiskey. And that's what was sort of sold in back alleys and out of people's basements up through the 1860s. So a lot of this sort of home distilling is happening in a neighborhood called Vinegar Hill, which is largely an Irish neighborhood, so there is a culture of alcohol and a culture of distilling there. And as opposed to the big distillers who also aren't paying their taxes, these people are definitely not paying their taxes. It's the difference between a bakery that makes cookies and you as an individual that makes cookies, okay? So maybe the bakery pays the taxes, but you probably think you can get away with not paying that tax on your cookies. So these are the people that began to be targeted and used as this idea of a criminal. Oh, they began to hide their distilleries then. This used to be something you could do open in public, but now you have to hide your cookie baking. So they're hiding their distilleries, and one of the most popular fronts for distillery was a soap making factory. Because when soap was made in the 19th century, they rendered animal fat and animal parts, so it smelled really, really, really bad, and it would hide the sort of sweet smell of fermenting alcohol. So the front store would make something disgusting like soap, and then in the back you'd have a couple stills where you were making this Brooklyn rum, all right? So you were trying to hide your business now because now it had been criminalized. So on this alley called Dickson Place, here is what is the Whiskey War. So this is also a rendering of Dixie Place. And what happens is let me make sure I get the year right. 1869. Okay, so on December 3rd, 1869, a militia comes together, which is mostly of German Civil War veterans, and they march on this predominantly Irish neighborhood. So there's also an idea of ethnicity and race here too. Like the Germans were considered the good immigrants and the Irish were considered the bad immigrants. The Germans brewed beer, which wasn't being criminalized, and the Irish distilled whiskey, which was being criminalized. So you've got this idea of who is good and bad in this. So this militia of several thousand men march on Vinegar Hill, which is a neighborhood that still exists. It's by the Brooklyn Navy Yard, and specifically on Dickson Place, because they're going to bust up all these illegal stills. The newspapers actually sided with the residents. I'm going to read to you, this is a quote, I think from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which is still published today, describing the events on December 3rd, 1869. A still had been seized and placed on a cart ready for transportation to the Naval Yard. The soldiers who had been placed to guard the horse, cart, and driver were withdrawn. Several young men sauntering about, seeing the still unguarded, leaped upon the cart and at a rattling pace drove away, leaving the driver standing upon the sidewalk. The soldiers and revenue officers were compelled to take a good deal of chaff from the sidewalk, but as that broke no bones, they paid but little attention. They were advised of the existence of illicit stills in remarkably strange places, and men with unheard of names were said to manufacture most singular whiskeys from the queerest materials. No tongues were as loud as those of the women, and their sallies provoked frequent laughter. So, if you didn't pick up on it, that was a very polite way of saying that in these houses, you see all the women actually up there, that people are so angry that the government is marching on their neighborhood, they're essentially shouting at the distillers like, yeah, I'm making whiskey, I've got a still hidden up my ass, like things like that. And it's women that are doing this. I'm not even exaggerating. That is exactly what they're saying. The newspaper is just being really nice about it, and probably far filthier things, because even though it's the 1860s, people are people. Always remember that. We have not changed as human beings. So they're not throwing bricks and things, but they are throwing human waste at the soldiers too. They are lobbing shit out of windows at the people coming into their neighborhood. They're so mad because, all right, these are essentially Civil War soldiers that are now marching on their neighborhood. And a lot of the editorials are saying, why is the government sending troops into Brooklyn? This is not the South. This is, why are you warring with your own people? We don't deserve to be treated this way. So this whole idea that now these people are criminals where they weren't before, again, now the government is sending military action against its own people, against something that they feel they have a right to do in their own neighborhood. And this is an illustration from the time from 1869. And the thing I love the most about it is this is a still. This is the implement that you boil alcohol, and then the alcohol sort of drips out this thing called a worm at the end. And I love that even the still is like animate in this moment. It looks like it's protesting and rebelling and fighting, that it's a character in this whole thing too, right at the center of this, what is essentially a riot, or a near riot, very nearby to where we are right now in Brooklyn. So what is the resolution of this? Well, there really isn't any. We hit a Great Depression in 1873, and the whole idea of taxes and alcohol takes a back seat to the bigger issues that we're having on Wall Street. Panic is just another word for depression. This is the worst depression our country had until 1929, and it lasted for about 16 years, from 1873 to 1886. So a lot of the illegal distilling activity either people were not doing it as much, or the government just didn't have the time to care as much. So it became less of sort of a fight between the people and the government. But this excise tax, this tax on alcohol, remained up until Prohibition. And up until Prohibition, it was the number one way that we funded our government. We had a little bit income tax, we had tariffs from imported goods, and we had the alcohol tax, which is one of the big reasons that Prohibition didn't make any sense, because we lost tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue during Prohibition when alcohol was made illegal to produce. And now after Prohibition was finally repealed, now we continue to tax alcohol as well as other items that are considered essentially what Hamilton called luxury items, we now essentially call like vice items. So we tax not only alcohol, but things like cigarettes too, also have a tax on them. And those things go to fund either state or our federal government. So that's the history of taxation. People weren't super happy about it, but a lot of it had a lot less to do with giving part of your income to the government to help run the country, and the specifically what was being taxed. The fact that this tax criminalized something that people considered an everyday activity. And to this day, it is still illegal to distill in your home. You can make a little bit of wine, you can make a certain amount of beer, but you cannot distill. And there are advocacy groups that are working against that, because if you want to learn how to be a distiller, you only have two options. You go work for a major distiller, or you do it illegally, which is how many of the people who are currently opening distilleries in Brooklyn got started. They just did it illegally in their backyards. But the only reason it's truly illegal is because they're not paying a tax on that alcohol that is being produced. So it's still the same idea that Americans were upset about in the 1790s and in the 1860s. Questions? Thoughts? Feelings? So, oh wait, one more, sorry. That's my book. It's a good read, I promise. That's my website, 4 Pounds Flour, and that's all my social media too. I'm on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I'm not on Snapchat, sorry. But I talk about food history, and I talk more importantly about why history is relevant to us today, why you should care about this stuff. So look me up. No questions? Go for it. Yeah. Oh, and I should be more specific. It was a largely German militia because 10% of the Union Army during the Civil War were German immigrants. And there were so many German immigrants living in New York that in the 1860s, New York was the 3rd largest German-speaking city on the planet. So it was like the two big ethnic groups. New York was about 25% German and about 25% Irish. And a lot of Germans from New York had fought in the Union Army. So all those things coming together meant that the militia that was pulled together was largely German Civil War vets. Go on. Yeah, and actually, that actually reminds me too, there were arrests made during the Whiskey Rebellion. Even though the crowd sort of dispersed, they arrested a lot of the sort of main organizers, but Washington eventually did pardon them all. So there was a little bit of sympathy from the government for what the West was going through. They sort of recognized that their tax plan wasn't a good one, and they eventually forgave the people that rebelled. Yeah, people here were arrested. I don't have as much detail about them because it was just considered, the Irish people were considered so low, so like bottom rung of the ladder, that those sorts of things were more difficult to document. People cared less about what happened to them, if that makes sense. I mean, I'll be very frank about it. They're treated both how black people were treated in the 1860s and how the police are treated today. So we don't have as much documentation to say, like, this person was arrested, this person was fine, this person had the crap beaten out of them, because that documentation just wasn't taken in the same way it was in the 1790s when we're talking about, like, white, fairly wealthy farmers. Other thoughts or questions? People are people. Remember that this whole semester. People are kind, people are mean, they're violent, they're caring, they're all those things. So you're going to spend the next couple months studying people that died a long, long, long time ago. But whenever you think about this history, try putting yourself into their shoes and understanding it. Something can be said for worldview and how worldview changes over time, but human emotion is always really similar, human motivation. So even though we're talking about something kind of dense and abstract like taxation, hopefully you can relate to some of these feelings and emotions on these opposing sides and why people acted the way they did and why that sort of brings us to the present day. To me, that's the key part about understanding history, understanding it not just as battles and dates, but as human motivation and human reactions too. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming today. Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Sarah.